On this episode, illegal government spying, violence against the police, and the threat from China. Coming up next on 3 in a Row.
I'm sick of being cautious. I'ma go cause something, can't stop this. I'ma stay.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of 3 in a Row. I'm excited to bring you tonight's stories. Now, for those of you that are new to the show, I try to bring you 3 stories every episode. They are what I think you need to know about the news of today, and I try to bring them to you in a fair, honest, and objective way with only just a little bit of my own opinion tied in. But we all have opinions, so share yours below and let me know what you think. Our first story comes out of the Wall Street Journal, and it's coming from Israel. Well, it turns out that Israel is having a problem with government surveillance, illegal government surveillance. Now, that's nothing that we've ever had to deal with here in the United States. Israeli authorities launched a state inquiry on Monday into allegations that the country's police illicitly use spyware to hack the phones of political activists, senior government bureaucrats, and the people close to former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, this has actually been in the news for a couple of days now from various sources. There is a company called NSO Group that is based in Israel, and they created a software called Pegasus. Israel's police say they use a variety of spyware tools, including one developed by Israel's NSO Group known for its Pegasus software, which can completely take over a smartphone without the target knowing. The police haven't said how similar their spyware is to Pegasus, only that Israeli law allows them limited access. And what makes this so devastating is not only does it hack into them, but it hacks into them in a way that the owner of the phone, the operator of the phone, will never even know that it's happened. They could potentially hack into your phone, turn on your microphone, turn on your camera, and you would have no idea that it's actually being used. So this is an incredibly powerful piece of software, and it's actually very, very dangerous, as you can imagine, the privacy implications, particularly when used by the government. Now, the reason that this is important to you is there are reports that this NSO Group met to demonstrate their Pegasus software to the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, in 2020. The FBI denies that they actually bought the software or that they've ever used that software. At the heart of the allegation is whether the police use spyware without proper judicial oversight and against individuals not suspected of any major wrongdoing. Israeli police have backed off their initial denials of wrongdoing. Now, you know it's not going well for the Israeli police when they come out and say, no, we didn't do anything wrong. We didn't do anything wrong. And then they come back later and they're asked a second time and they're like, we're not going to say that we didn't do anything wrong, but we're not going to admit that we did anything wrong. That's a very, very bad place for the Israeli government to start. Now, when the FBI, the United States FBI, says they never bought it, they never used it, they just wanted to see its capabilities to know. I can see where that would be the case. I know that if I were in that realm, if I were the FBI, I would want to know what capabilities were out there, both defensive purposes, meaning trying to protect against it, and also offensive purposes, just a general knowledge. I get where the FBI would want to meet to investigate and figure out what is this technology, how it could be used for good or bad, so that they could, one, protect against it, but also potentially use it. Clearly, this is a very, very dangerous tool and a very slippery slope for governments to get into. Now, that's not to say that we aren't already giving big tech, Google, for example, in their Android phones, and Alexa with Amazon, and even Siri and with our iPhone data. We're not giving all of our data already to these massive multinational corporations that have zero interest in actually doing anything good for us, and every incentive to use that for monetary gain and for control. So this immediately makes me want to question our government, particularly our federal authorities and our state and local authorities as well, to a certain extent, what their policies are on using these kinds of tools, because this Pegasus software is not the only one out there. What are the laws? What are the civil protections against this kind of thing from our federal government, particularly, and to a certain extent from our local and state government as well? Whether you're Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, it doesn't really matter. This is a particular topic that we should all be paying attention to, and we should support any politician who is working to fight against these types of big government surveillance programs and are trying to protect our individual freedoms and our individual privacy. Those people we should support. Democrat, liberal, doesn't matter. We should get behind those people. In our next article, we're talking about violence against the police. During President Biden's first year in office, there were more directed attacks against police than any time since 1995. According to an analysis of data collected by the FBI, more police officers were intentionally killed in the line of duty in 2021, President Biden's first year in office, than any year since 1995. The types of killings and violence against police officers that we're talking about here, they're felonious assaults. These are cases where people ambush the police or that they attack the police without the police even provoking them in any kind of way. In 2020, after the George Floyd riots and after some of the unrest that we had in the Black Lives Matter movement, and we start looking at the whole defund the police effort, I have a suspicion, and I have to ask the question, do we think Black Lives Matter movement, particularly the idea of defunding the police, had anything to do with this? I think that's a valid question that we should be asking ourselves. Yes, we should protect against police violence, but when the rhetoric ramps up against the police to the point where the police become the enemy, does that increase the potential violence against police, even in unprovoked circumstances? Jason Johnson, president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, said, "We believe it's a combination of the George Floyd protest, riots, if you will, a general feeling of a preference for less law enforcement and less prosecution and less policing. Law enforcement officers have essentially been marginalized and demoralized and cast aside and encouraged not to enforce the law. And so we've seen a massive jump in homicide rates in cities across America." If you start thinking about the problem of defunding police, and yes, there are some bad apples out there. I'm not denying that that's the case. But when you start talking about defunding the police, when you want to solve a problem, why would you take money away from the problem? Normally, when you want to fix a problem, if we want to fix education, isn't the standard mantra from politicians that if we want to support education and improve education, what do we have to do? We have to throw money at it. So why would you want to defund the police? If the police are struggling, you don't defund them, you give them more money. If more money is actually going to the police, you're going to likely see an increase in the number of more qualified police officers, people who may not otherwise want to be police because of low salaries or general sentiment against police officers these days. You have maybe a better character of person possibly going into law enforcement. Additionally, you're going to have potentially more officers on the street, and more officers on the street is going to reduce the stress on individual officers. Won't it potentially make them more calm and more capable of thinking through situations and making better decisions, as opposed to these snap judgments, which in a lot of cases have led to some of the tragic accidents, bad decisions by some of the police officers we've seen in the news in the last couple of years? Mr. Johnson continues, "Until and unless we see some leadership, both in the White House and in individual cities, district attorneys that are willing to hold police accountable when they're wrong, but are willing to support them when they're right, we're going to continue to speak up, not only with increasing levels of violent crime, but increasing numbers of assaults and killings of law enforcement officers." I think the entire anti-police agenda that certain politicians and certain parties and certain people and ways of thinking have adopted over the last couple of years are very, very toxic. I am all for fixing police brutality issues and protecting everyone's civil rights, regardless of race or nationality. I think that's a problem that we need to address. I think that the police need more funds. I think they need our support, whether it's individual support or community level support. But I think it's important for all of us to, one, support the police. They're trying, in general, they're trying to do their very best. And secondly, we need to teach our children how to interact with police properly and to support the police. Yes, we should be careful, and yes, we should know our rights. In general, police officers are good people that we should support. All right, our next article comes from A Land Down Under. Now, Australia's got a couple problems. One of them is they've really, really overreacted to COVID. I mean, like really bad, really taken away a lot of people's personal freedoms. But that's not what we're talking about today. The problem that they face is that they're friendly to the US, they're friendly to Great Britain, friendly to NATO, and they are right near China and the South China Sea. And that is going to become a problem for them. The Australian Defence Minister Peter Dutton said China has 20 points of presence in the South China Sea, which does not help stability in the region. If we continue on that trajectory, then I think we'll lose the next decade. And my sense is that we're better off being honest about that. Now, I think that's a good policy for them to have. Their strategic situation with China is not particularly good. And I think it's good for their defense minister to stand up and admit it and say, hey, Australia, this is something we need to pay attention to. He said he believed it was important to speak out for China for two main reasons: to educate the Australian public and to ensure that the past decade was not repeated in which Beijing had militarized the South China Sea. Is a lesson that I think we here in America should learn, which is that the threat from China is real. And I don't mean like Red Dawn, parachuting Chinese military into the west coast of the United States. That's not the threat that I'm talking about. The Chinese are very much not our friends, and they very much do not want the United States to succeed. And I'm not talking about the individual Chinese people. I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party, and they are the ones who run China. When you talk about Chinese businesses, really talking about businesses that are run hand in hand in lockstep with the Chinese Communist Party. We are seeing many, many cases where U.S. businesses are partnering with Chinese companies, giving ownership stakes into Chinese companies, and these Chinese arms of these companies are stealing technology. They are literally stealing the companies from under these Western corporations, and then claiming the technologies from those companies and calling them Chinese technologies, and then basically blocking out the Western part of the company from having any control over those technologies. And that is happening over and over and over. I have to give them credit for it. To see a politician, particularly a defense minister of a country, to come out and say, hey, this is a problem and this is something we all need to know about. It's something we need to address. That's a little bit refreshing. I think too often politicians will hold their tongue and not want to say things like that for fear of recriminations by other politicians. Because, for example, if you took President Biden and you took the Secretary of Defense, and if he were to come out and say something like that, then reporters would then turn to President Biden and say, the Defense Secretary just said this. What are your thoughts? And he would say, we're strong and we're strong and we're strong, and not actually address the thing. But that's a little bit of a fresh concept for a politician to come out and be that transparent, and I kind of like it. This guy's kind of my new best friend. Now, evidently, there are 4 nations that make up the Quad that are going to be meeting shortly, and he made these remarks just before that meeting. The 4 nations which make up the Quad, Australia, the US, India, and Japan, will look to intensify cooperation on security and development assistance in a bid to stand up to China. I think it's a regional imperative for countries to stand up against China. They are building islands in the South China Sea and then making military bases on those islands to help support any kind of military presence or military actions that they want to take here in the near future. And I think this is really important for us to pay attention to, because as Ukraine and Russia situation with NATO is, heating up, I think that opens the door for China to make a move for Taiwan. Will they actually make a move for Taiwan? We don't know. We'll see. But when you start to talk about distracting the United States and NATO with a potential threat in Eastern Europe, then it opens the door on the other side of the globe for China to potentially make a move for Taiwan. Well, those are the 3 articles that I think you need to know about today. Hope you enjoyed this episode of 3 in a Row, and until next time.
I just wanna stay bad, stay mad, chip on my shoulder cause they treat me like an outcast. I ain't gonna take that, stay back, I'll be swinging hard till the hits come in all caps. I ain't gonna lay back, pray that someone's gonna help me, ain't nobody like that.